And welcome to Common Sense Media's Appy Hour on air. I'm Jason Jackson, Common Sense Regional Manager in West Virginia. I work with teachers and parents and students to use Common Sense media tools and resources to help schools, families safely navigate the online world. Thanks for joining us today, where you can kick back, relax, and learn about a new digital tool. Each month, Common Sense Media hosts an Appy Hour on air, where we'll bring you the best digital learning tools and showcase teachers using them in their teaching. This week, Common Sense Media is hosting 2 webinars. The next one will be on Thursday. You can view these on Common Sense Media's page under Educators and click on the Professional Development link. For the month of July, Graphite focuses on gaming and play. Have you ever wanted to build your own city? Think you can design the perfect metropolis? You're in luck today. We're going to showcase SimCity. It's one of the digital tools on Common Sense Media's free service Graphite. Graphite is a platform which offers rigorous ratings and reviews of apps, websites, and games by teachers for teachers. Graphite, let me pull this up here. You can sign up for free at graphite.org, and hopefully I can show you guys the review of SimCity. If not, I saw it in your slides.
Got it.
You got it? There we go. So SimCity's review. I encourage you to join the conversation today on Twitter at Appy Hour. Hopefully you guys can see this. Appy Hour. Tell us about your favorite tech tool for classroom use. I encourage you to tweet about the following question. What are some great tools that you use to teach safe and responsible use of digital media in your classroom? So anyway, you can share your experience as we go through this. Anyway, today we have a great speaker for you. His name is David Thomas. He's the Director of Academic Technology at the University of Colorado in Denver, faculty in the College of Architecture and Planning. And he's also a scholar of fun and a longtime game journalist. Today, David will be covering SimCity and how it might enhance learning in your classroom. Now, for a little bit longer discussion about SimCity, let's hear from David on SimCity.
All right, thanks, Jason. So happy to be talking about SimCity today. It's a game that I've played since its very first incarnation through the many years, and yet still, as an educator, I would still have to ask the question, what's wrong with SimCity? And I'd like to take 15 or 20 minutes here and kind of talk you through kind of some different ways to think about SimCity and hopefully then give you some great ideas about how you might use SimCity in your classroom. Just to let you know, in addition to my kind of game journalism background, I've taught, it's been a while since I've done this, but I used to teach an urban planning class at the University of Colorado, and so we use SimCity in the higher ed environment. And these days I teach a class on games and learning, so I get to interact with K-12 teachers every spring and kind of help them think about how to use games to teach. So some of this is kind of a digest of things that I've experienced over the years, and so let's get started. So when we talk about SimCity, I think the first thing that's really interesting to me is kind of like, what is SimCity? I mean, we're all so familiar with it because we probably all played it or at least have seen it around, that it's kind of part of the cultural furniture, I guess you could say. I mean, SimCity is such a well-known and popular game, and I think that we could probably make the argument that SimCity is the most successful and well-known educational game ever. Except there's a couple of problems with that. Let's dig into it. The first thing is what is SimCity? Well, I looked up a little bit just to let you know that there's actually been 6 entire versions of SimCity since the first one in 1989. There's been 3 console versions, so they've been on the Nintendo machines and the Super Nintendo. There's been 6 mobile versions for telephones and for portable gaming devices, and then there's these kind of brand spin-offs, SimFarm, SimCopter, and yes, there is a SimCity card game. I have a copy of it. I don't think it's a very playable game, but it actually exists. So we started thinking about what is SimCity. The first thing is we're really talking about a set of games that are all kind of sort of taking on the subject of cities, but I just want you to think about the fact that SimCity itself isn't a game as much as it's a franchise concept of exploring cities. Now, there's another problem about thinking about SimCity as a learning tool or as a learning kind of a game is because of this guy. And this is Will Wright. This is the guy that made up SimCity. And as the story goes, Will Wright was very interested in this guy, G. Forrester's Urban Dynamics. And it's a book that really talked about cities as these kind of big organic living systems that could be described mathematically. And Will Wright found that to be really fascinating. And so you'd sort of think from its fundamental beginning, SimCity was really all about trying to explore the science and nature of cities, except for one thing. Will Wright's a game designer, and from the very beginning, SimCity had disasters. So blowing up cities was always as much fun as actually making them. And I just want to kind of indicate to you a little bit that part of the longevity, the elasticity, and the continued interest in SimCity has a lot to do with the fact that it is first and foremost a game. It's a game. And when we look at it as a game, I think we always have to step back and remember that SimCity may not actually be the prototypical educational game, because its mission wasn't to be educational. Its mission was to be entertainment. And let me take that through a little bit further and kind of say, so what is SimCity then? I mean, we kind of know what it is as a game, but what is it? I would offer this definition to you, and bear with me. I'll make sense of this over the course of a little talk here, but I'd say that really SimCity is this dynamic game system, and it comes to life when a player makes their choices, and it tells a particular story about how cities are developed and managed. And that may sound like a kind of a high-minded, a mouthful of words, but what I think is that's a better description of SimCity, because what SimCity is not is this. It's definitely not a city simulator. And so we kind of already have to pull away this idea that, oh yeah, playing SimCity is like a way to simulate things that happen in a city, so that's a really good educational simulation. It's not. It's something else. Now, since that's all kind of conceptual, let me walk you through what I think some of the kind of the key problems are with SimCity as a simulator, but don't really hurt it as a game. And let's kind of do these things. And these are some examples that I will use with my classes. Here's a screenshot from the version of SimCity called SimCity Societies. And I love to ask students this question, like, does this look like a realistic cityscape? And for the most part, people will be like, yeah, it looks pretty realistic, except for the, all this, interface stuff down here on the bottom. But then I like to point out all the things that are really wackily wrong with this city image. I mean, the first thing is, here's this weird little old-time car, which is dramatically out of scale for the city. It's a giant car, and look at that road it's trying to drive up. There's nowhere in the world you'd drive up a 45-degree angle. I mean, it's just basically impossible. And look at these people. They're really teeny tiny people, and look at the wall they're walking next to. That would be the weirdest bridge ever, to have like this 6-foot-high wall, still with a fence on top of it. So it's playing tricks with your eyes. And then I also noticed this, I think it's really funny, is like there's 3 bridges in the span of 3 blocks. That's probably not something that you would see in most cities. It's too expensive to build bridges. And you look at these retaining walls, they're actually like 18 feet high. And again, these are really subtle things, but when you're trying to talk about like a city, and you say, oh, here's a game that's like a city simulator, and you look at it, and it's actually telling you all these things that are really not true about cities. It's an image of a city. It's a fantasy image. It's no more real than Star Wars is. It's just kind of an idea. So I like to first of all play with students and try to get them to look closely at the SimCity screens and think about what's real and what's false. That time quickly, that the weather doesn't really affect the game, that that the graphics actually play with scale in these really funky kinds of ways that you just don't see initially. And so we're starting to look really critically at SimCity. But wait, there's more. My European friends always would look at SimCity, especially the older versions, it's getting better over time, and they would say, why are all the cities in SimCity, they all look like American cities? So on the top is a SimCity, on the bottom you might recognize as London. Europeans always found SimCity to be a bizarre game because you ended up making cities that look like American cities, mainly American Midwest cities. And why was that? Well, Will Wright's an American. He built the game to make cities the way that he knew cities were. So there's even a certain sense that when I tell you that SimCity is telling you a certain kind of story about cities, it's really telling you a certain story about American cities, and they're not really cities that work or even act or even look like cities from other parts of the world. But I could let all that slide. That's kind of minor stuff. The real problem with SimCity as a teacher of teaching urban planning, is this. What do you play in the game? You play the role of the mayor, right? That's your job. You're the mayor. There's just one problem with that, because in the real world, the mayor is elected, the mayor can be kicked out of office, and the mayor has to respond to the constituents or the citizens of the city. In fact, you don't play a mayor, whatever they call it in SimCity, you probably play something closer to this guy. Because in a real city, I would say it this way, I would say the real thing that you have to understand about how cities work is to understand that the complexity of cities is all based on the principle of this public interest in private property. And if there's no private property, then basically you're running an ant colony, or perhaps you're really playing Zoo Tycoon. So already I'm trying to get you to think a little bit about what's wrong with SimCity is nothing's wrong with it as a game. It's a lot of fun. But as a city simulator, it teaches you things that are actually patently false about cities. And in a way, this has been one of the most pernicious things SimCity has done, is to teach people this idea that cities work and operate like a clockwork, that if you could just tune it correctly, the city would run. Now, this is not to take away all the great things that SimCity can do, and I'd like to talk about those, but I want to kind of just get started by actually being a little bit critical about our long-term love of SimCity. So what you get is kind of this picture, I think. On the top line are the things that we already know SimCity is good at helping us teach. Zoning, commercial, industrial, residential, the idea of kind of the interplay of taxation and how it affects behavior in the city, and some of this dynamics of the city, how lowering taxes reduces the amount of money you have. You don't if you spend too much on fire, you don't have money to build roads, but if you don't spend enough on fire, you burn down the city. And those are really valuable things, but sometimes those are actually pretty easy things to teach because they're all basically pretty simple principles. I think down on the bottom is probably using SimCity out of the box the way it is to stimulate, kind of as done in short sense here, stimulate a critical discussion of media and particularly games is the right way to go. Now I know, in K-12 you might say, how am I going to do this in an elementary school? I think kids need this. They need to be sensitized towards looking more closely at their media. I mean, a kid can understand, things that are out of scale when it's pointed out to them. They can understand that, their city works differently from SimCity. They can be observant of that. And certainly in high school, I mean, kids are really very able to take on these concepts. So I think that just the start of the matter here is to think about SimCity not just as a way to teach some pretty simple didactic things. What's commercial zoning? What's industrial zoning? What's residential zoning? How does taxation work? What are some of the interplays of taxation with public services? I mean, that stuff is a 30-minute unit. Why spend a week playing SimCity just to teach that? But if you use SimCity to teach that, make sure you kind of have this other piece. Create these critical discussions about this game. Now from there, I kind of like to launch into a broader discussion of this and then bring it back into how I have used SimCity to teach some, I think, some pretty interesting concepts and some other games that I've used to teach about cities. To get there, we got to start with this kind of we got to break this loop, this chain, because I think as teachers we naturally say, oh, I want to teach about cities, I'll use SimCity, sort of the way you'd say, I want to teach about zoos, I'll use Zoo Tycoon. I want to teach about business, oh, I'll use Roller Coaster Tycoon. And what we do is we look at the subject matter of the game and we try to translate it right over into the topic that we're teaching. I want you to think about this a little more separately. I'd like for you to think about games on their own and learning domains on their own. And what I mean is, the games we'll talk about could be anything, and the learning domains could be anything. They could be math, they could be science. In this case, we're talking about cities, but the learning domains could be anything. And when you start to think about this on a little more abstract level, I think that what you're actually looking for is a way to put what games do and what you need in your learning domain and kind of find those overlaps. And so in the case of SimCity, there's the game, there's the stuff that happens in the game, and there's this learning domain trying to learn about cities, and then I can start looking at those kinds of overlaps. And I can just sort of say, is this a fun way to engage my topic? What does the game mean? I mean, in the case of SimCity, SimCity is telling you a particular story about cities that I think under criticism creates some really rich discussion about what real cities are, how they operate, how they ought to operate. Maybe use games just for engagement. It's kind of the parallel to fun, right? Maybe you just use the game as just sort of like a, it's Mary Poppins, just a spoonful of sugar to help the learning content go down. And sometimes maybe it's just something different. But what you're looking for here is not for the game to completely be in the learning domain, but rather let the game be the game and find the parts of the game, the pieces of the game that really speak to stuff in your learning area. So if this sounds, again, a little too abstract, let me break it down and kind of show you how this plays out, in this area of thinking about, like, teaching about cities and city life and urban dynamics. So back to my little definition of what SimCity is. A dynamic game system that comes to life when a player makes choices telling a particular story about how cities are developed and managed. This is a description of this game, right? This is what SimCity does. And I highlighted the things that I think are the most interesting pieces of that game that I could use as a teacher when trying to talk about cities. The dynamic game system. I think dynamics, the way that different variables interoperate, is something it's easier, but more easily experienced than it is talked about. And so SimCity does bring dynamic game systems to life. It's great at that. Player making choices. This is very important because it starts to, it's part of where the fun comes from, but it's also the key in SimCity is that you feel like you can make any choice you want. You feel like you can make any city you want. You can make choices and see what happens. And I think that choice making is really another thing that's very hard to do sometimes in just a normal kind of lecture style lesson delivery, but letting the people or the students play with things and bring that to life is very important. And then this particular story, and it's important to me that it's a particular story because that opens itself up to some criticism. And so I look at this dynamic game system, player choice, and particular story, and then I can kind of start to think through, like, well, what other games give me those kinds of tools? What other games give me dynamic systems, player choices, and tell particular stories that apply to the city? And so what I come with is a couple of examples for you. The first example would be a game. It's an older game. I don't even know if it's still really available, but I like this game. It was called City Life, and ironically, it was developed by some Europeans. And it's very much like SimCity, but it told a different kind of a story about cities, a very different kind of a story about cities. And the part of the story that I think is the most fascinating, and it's kind of encapsulated by this diagram, in SimCity, you basically just have residents, and they're all the same. But in City Life, the game, you had 6 different kinds of citizens. Elite suits, blue collars, have-nots, fringes, and radical chic, or kind of the urban hipsters or whatever. And it turned out that in this game, certain groups liked certain groups and didn't like other groups. So the way this little wheel works is that if you look at the elites, they could get along living near the radical chic and the suits, but they didn't want to be anywhere near the fringe, the have-nots, or the blue collars. So when you were designing your city, you couldn't build a fancy apartment block next to blue-collar, houses, because there would be a lot of like class tension. Now this is crazy in a game, right? This is just a part of the game. So you actually had to balance your city in terms of this social dynamic, which was very different. And again, I'm less interested in City Life just because it's a game about cities. I'm really interested in looking at City Life in comparison to SimCity and saying, notice how these tell very different stories about cities, and trying to create discussion around that. And when you kind of take this unbundling of the game and the learning domain a little further, you would get to where I finally got with my urban planning class, which was this. I started to discover that games that seemed to have nothing to do with cities were great games about cities. So here's 3 games that I would use and I like. And so you may or may not be familiar with these games, but the first game is Carcassonne, and it's a great game. And it's a tile laying game. So you build this city, player draws a tile, and they put it on the board, and they try to lay the tiles in a way that will earn them the most points. But what's interesting about Carcassonne is that, much like a city, it's open negotiation, right? I can see the tile, I can say, no, don't play it there, and now I can see what you're doing, and then we start to create this system of people collaborating and people competing about the control of space. And so Carcassonne, although it's sort of nominally about building this medieval city, is really a game that helps me bring to life for students the actual negotiation that goes on in city building, the public interest in private property, as I would say. Blockus, if you played, is a fun little another tile laying game. And the great thing about Blockus is it has this really simple rule system where you can only connect your color at the corners. And it's a fun game. You can really play it. I play it with my 5-year-olds. I mean, it's a game that really spans the range of K-12. And you play Blockus, and you say, well, what does Blockus have to do with cities? Well, you have students play Blockus for a little while, and then you start to say, how do city patterns develop? I mean, is it all planned out, or how do cities develop a character? And then you can start to open up conversations about how really simple rules, like little simple rules in Blockus, like connecting only at the corners, starts to create very predictable and identifiable patterns of layout. And you can actually then start to talk about how urban planning is the art of trying to come up with simple design principles that then individuals can use those principles in a seemingly infinite number of ways to create reliable city patterns. And so again, Blockus has nothing to do with cities, but it helps teach something that's really hard to touch about cities, which is little changes that unfold into really big complex things. And finally, a personal favorite, the game Flux. I don't know if you played Flux. If you haven't played Flux before, go out and buy it. It's a wonderful game. But the long story short on Flux is that the rules keep changing. You play cards, and the cards change the rules, how many cards you draw, how many cards you play. It changes the goals of the game. And so the game is constantly in flux. And again, you'd think, well, this must have nothing to do with urban planning. And in fact, it doesn't really have anything narratively to do with urban planning. It doesn't tell a story about urban planning. But what it actually tells something about is how people have to adapt to constantly changing systems. That what other people do changes what you do. What you draw, what you have as resources changes how you play, and you have to kind of keep on top of this. And one of my most happy moments in teaching was when I took a bunch of students to a big urban redevelopment project in Denver, and I had a former city council member talk about the intricate politics of this development. And at the end of it, I asked them, I said, so is the Union Station project more like SimCity or Flux? And all the students said, it's like Flux. So in other words, at the end of the day, I was able to help them start to understand the complexities of what it was like to do urban planning, what cities were really like, not so much with SimCity, but with a game like Flux. And to me, that's just sort of the fascinating joy of unbundling games from their subject matter to start looking at games and how you play and engage and interact with them, and combining that back in with the really hard things that are to teach, things that involve choice, things that involve dynamic systems, certain kinds of subtle stories that really need to be taken apart and criticized. So in summary, I wanted to kind of give you, and this is a lot of text on one slide, but just some general takeaways from this. The first is that, yeah, SimCity is great for teaching basic urban planning concepts. But that's not much. I'm not even sure SimCity is worth it just for that. But don't stop there. Use SimCity as a way to start talking about games, the stories games tell, and how media always has a point of view, and to use SimCity as a way to get students talking and thinking about the media they consume. Use SimCity to create a platform to engage in a conversation about what makes real cities work. And again, from kindergarten all the way to to high school and beyond, you can look at a game like SimCity and say, what's missing in this game that you have in your life? Kids would probably say like, oh, well, there's no bike paths, or my house doesn't look like that, or we don't have those kinds of buildings in my neighborhood. It really allows the kids to reflect and think about what they see on screen and what happens in their real life. You can also use that as a platform for then talking about, well, in your SimCity, what would you do? How would you build it? What tools would you like to have? I also would say think more broadly about how games work and what they might be capable of teaching. And I summarized a lot of ideas there. But really, at the end of the day, it's like to be more versatile in your use of games. Don't just say, I want to teach math, I need a math game. I want to teach biology, I need a biology game. Think about other kinds of games that might actually help you teach those really difficult to grasp concepts. And then I would just say in general, use games to teach really hard things. Don't use games just for drill and practice. Use games to teach things that deal with dynamic systems, decision making, flexibility, the need for cooperation and competition. I mean, all the kinds of things that games are naturally good at. So that's what I have for you in a 20-minute blast. If there's any questions out there, I'd be happy to answer them, and I'm gonna unshare my slides here.
There's David back. So you gave us a lot to think about today about using SimCity in the classroom. Is it more the decision-making process for students you think we should be looking at more than the actual simulation of building your own city?
I think in SimCity, yeah, it's some of the decision making, but I think it's really a lot of how we think about cities. I mean, I guess this is what it really amounts to, is most of us live in cities, and even if we live in rural areas, we probably live closer to a kind of a city life than people really lived in a rural area. And how we think about cities is really important. I mean, how we think about cities determines where we live, where we work, if we're old enough, how we vote. And I think that, SimCity has this really distinct story it wants to tell, and it also starts to lead you down the road of thinking that if you just had a smart enough person running the city would run like a clock. And it's just not true. And so I think that, SimCity, I'm using SimCity in two contexts. In one context, I'm using it as SimCity the game and what it says about cities. And I think you have to be careful with that. But I'm also using SimCity as an example of how we do this with learning games all over the place, which is to sort of say the game's probably carrying messages that aren't necessarily what's in your best interest in terms of what you're trying to teach. And so it's always important to try to be disconnecting that a little bit and helping your students learn how to do that. So that's the media literacy side. But in terms of SimCity, SimCity is great. It's so much fun. It's so much fun to build a city, see how it works, to blow it up. I just think we have to be careful about then saying, because SimCity is about cities, it's a good game to teach about cities. Left alone, it's not a good game to teach about cities. In a context, it's a wonderful game to use to help crack open conversations and understanding about cities.
Very good. I'd like to give David a huge thank you today for helping us out and sharing his ideas on SimCity and gaming in general. So where do you find more tools about that's like SimCity that we talked about? You can find all of these tools on Graphite. And on Graphite you will find a whole bunch of different apps, websites, and games. Another example of a review right here. So I encourage you to sign up for Graphite, check out some of the tools we have offered there. Maybe do a field note. You can write a field note by clicking here and filling in a form. It doesn't take much. Just answer a few questions, how you'd rate it, how it worked for your classroom, whether your students liked it or not, and your overall take on it. You and thousands of other educators can then submit those field notes and help build a great repository of best practices around integration of apps, websites, and games for learning. So once again, visit us at graphite.org and join the community of teachers who are continuing the conversation by sharing reviews, ratings, and how they're incorporating digital learning tools in their teaching. Thank you all. David, thank you once again, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.